Imagine seeing a bomber so enormous that it looks like someone accidentally turned a passenger jet into a weapon. Now, give that aircraft 4 engines powerful enough to push more than 270 tons through the sky at twice the speed of sound, and then give it the ability to carry nuclear cruise missiles thousands of miles away. That aircraft is the Russian Tu-160, better known as the White Swan. But the strangest part of this aircraft's story isn't its size. It isn't even its speed, and it isn't the nuclear weapons. The strangest part is that Russia once lost almost its entire fleet of these bombers to a country that had only just become independent. And what happened next would eventually become one of the most controversial chapters in post-Soviet military history. But before we get there, let's appreciate just how ridiculous this aircraft actually is. The Tu-160 is officially the heaviest combat aircraft ever built. Its maximum takeoff weight can reach roughly 275 tons. That's around 606,000 pounds. To put that into perspective, imagine taking a Boeing 787, filling it with weapons, giving it enormous afterburning engines, and then telling it to fly at more than twice the speed of sound. That is basically the kind of engineering madness we're dealing with. And moving this giant through the sky requires 4 Kuznetsov NK-32 engines. Each engine can produce roughly 55,000 pounds of thrust with the afterburner running. Put 4 of them together, and you're looking at approximately 220,000 pounds of combined thrust. The result? A gigantic strategic bomber capable of reaching around Mach 2.05. That makes the Tu-160 dramatically faster than America's B-52 and B-2, and considerably faster than the B-1B in its modern configuration. But speed wasn't the only thing Soviet engineers were chasing. They wanted something that could carry an enormous payload, travel extraordinary distances, and still move fast enough to make interception extremely difficult. And that combination created an engineering nightmare. Because building something this big is difficult. The aircraft's structure had to survive tremendous aerodynamic forces, so roughly 30% of the airframe, including the critical central wing structure, was constructed from titanium. Sounds simple, right? It wasn't. Titanium is notoriously difficult to weld. Even tiny impurities introduced during welding can weaken the material and potentially cause catastrophic failure when the aircraft is subjected to enormous stresses. And then there's the nickname. The Russians call it the White Swan. That isn't just because the aircraft looks elegant when it's sitting on a runway. The white paint has a serious purpose. It's designed to help reflect the intense thermal radiation produced by a nuclear explosion. Because if you're operating a strategic nuclear bomber, surviving the blast you're delivering is probably a useful feature. And despite being a machine designed around nuclear warfare, the Tu-160 has some surprisingly ordinary features. The crew can spend an extremely long time inside this aircraft. So there's a small kitchen area, there's a kettle, there's an oven, and yes, there is a toilet, because even the people flying one of the world's most terrifying aircraft eventually have to deal with the same biological problems as everyone else. But perhaps the most unbelievable story involving this aircraft has nothing to do with combat. It happened in 1991. A woman named Elena worked as a clerk with one of the aviation units operating the Tu-160. She became friends with the squadron commander, Sergei Bezhkov. And one night, Sergei apparently asked her a question that most people would never expect to hear from a bomber commander. Did she want to go for a flight? She said yes. Sergei then gave her a flight suit and aviation helmet. With ground crews moving around the aircraft and preparations underway, he managed to get her into the co-pilot seat. And this wasn't some harmless passenger ride. At one point, Elena actually got to control the enormous bomber. Think about that. A 275-ton strategic nuclear aircraft. And someone who wasn't a trained bomber pilot was sitting in the cockpit and briefly flying it. And there's a reason Elena could physically control the aircraft. The Tu-160 uses a fly-by-wire flight control system. Instead of relying entirely on mechanical cables and pulleys, the pilot's inputs are translated into electronic commands. That makes controlling an enormous aircraft at high speed much more practical. But none of these stories compare to what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Because this is where the Tu-160 story takes a very dark turn. Between 1987 and 1991, the Soviet Union managed to build only 21 of these aircraft. Then, almost overnight, the Soviet Empire disappeared. Borders changed, governments collapsed, and suddenly, 19 Tu-160 bombers were sitting at an airbase in Pryluki. Except Pryluki wasn't in Russia anymore, it was in Ukraine. Ukraine had suddenly inherited a staggering military arsenal. Thousands of tanks, around 1,800 aircraft, and a huge portion of the former Soviet strategic nuclear infrastructure. Among that inheritance were 19 of the most sophisticated bombers ever produced by the Soviet Union. But there was a problem. These aircraft were incredibly expensive to operate. Ukraine was going through a brutal economic crisis and couldn't easily afford to maintain a fleet of enormous supersonic strategic bombers. Russia wanted them back, and Western governments didn't want a newly independent state struggling economically to retain a massive strategic weapons capability. So a disarmament process began, and what happened next is almost painful to watch. The White Swans were cut apart. Not damaged, not stored, cut apart. Their structures were destroyed so thoroughly that satellite imagery could verify the aircraft could no longer be reconstructed. But Russia wasn't prepared to let every remaining aircraft disappear. In 1999, Moscow made Ukraine an offer. Russia would cancel roughly $275 million of Ukrainian debt related to natural gas in exchange for 8 Tu-160 bombers, hundreds of Kh-55 cruise missiles, and 3 Tu-95 bombers. Ukraine accepted, and this decision would become much more controversial years later, because the very cruise missiles transferred back to Russia were later used against Ukrainian targets. The strategic equation had changed completely. There is another debate surrounding the Tu-160. Look at it next to an American B-1B Lancer, and the resemblance is obvious. Both have variable sweep wings. Both are enormous. Both were products of the Cold War, and both were designed around the same fundamental aerodynamic problem. But that doesn't mean one was simply copied from the other. The two aircraft were designed around different missions. The B-1B was heavily optimized for low-level penetration, allowing it to fly beneath enemy radar coverage and approach targets at low altitude. The Tu-160 took a different approach. Go high, go extremely fast, stay far away from enemy defenses, and launch long-range cruise missiles before the bomber ever needs to get close to the target. That's the philosophy behind the White Swan. It doesn't necessarily need to break through the strongest air defenses. It can launch its weapons from enormous distances and turn around, and that is why the Tu-160 remains an important component of Russia's strategic nuclear forces.